This video is brought to you by Raycon. Something pretty strange is happening on TikTok. And no, I'm not talking about kids cramming for exams by candlelight like it's the Middle Ages. I mean this.
Tradwives just believe that they are here as women for a different role, equally as important though.
The tradwives trend, married women practicing traditional gender roles, has its male corollary too. In recent years, popular influencers in the Manosphere have sought to reignite supposedly lost values of traditional masculinity, urging for a return to the way things used to be. So, what's going on? We live in an era of a widespread rejection of traditional sex and gender norms, a decreased interest in organized religion, and a rise of non-traditional relationship structures like ethical non-monogamy. So, a retreat to traditionalism seems, well, strange. Are we regressing back to some imagined blissful past? Are we becoming new Puritans? Or is trad life just the new astrology? Another way for us to find meaning? Well, let's find out in this Wisecrack edition when nostalgia gets toxic. But before we get into it, I want to tell you about this video sponsor, Raycon. I don't know about you all, but I basically always have earbuds in my ears, whether I'm on work calls, listening to music, listening to podcasts, listening to YouTube videos as I walk around the house. It's so important for me to have quality earbuds that I can use all day. And that's why I'm stoked to talk about Raycon's everyday earbuds, which not only look really sleek, but bring high sound quality to everything I listen to. Plus, they're super comfortable to wear, thanks to an optimized gel tip that adapts to the contours of your ears. This design helps them stay put no matter what I'm doing, which in some cases could be going on a hike, in other cases is dancing around my apartment when I think no one is watching. I love that I don't have to worry about them falling out. They're also water and sweat resistant, so I can really go for it and know that my earbuds are gonna keep working. They also offer 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life. And that's just one of the reasons they have more than 50,000 5-star reviews. Another reason? Well, Raycon's everyday earbuds offer quality audio at half the price of other premium brands. Think about it this way. Wouldn't you love to have 2 pairs of incredibly useful earbuds for what you might normally use to just buy one? I don't know about you, but having a backup is super, super helpful. And we've all had that feeling of realizing we've lost our earbuds, left them at home, they're not charged. It sucks. You can click the link in the description right now or go to buyraycon.com/wisecrack and get 15% off your purchase. That's buyraycon.com/wisecrack to get yourself 15% off a choice pair of Raycon earbuds. But now, back to the show. Lately, a lot of people are looking to tradition for meaning, and not just TikTokers cosplaying Betty Draper. There's been heated discourse about sex scenes in movies, with many young people objecting, on principle, to seeing Hollywood stars bone down in 4K. Side note, there are actually fewer sex scenes in movies today because production companies seeking the widest possible international audience find PG-13 films to be a safer bet. Thank God these kids didn't come of age in the era of Basic Instinct and Wild Things. Anyway, there's also been a rise of Catholic conversion among millennials, popularized by Red Scare podcast co-host and cousin Greg's short-lived crush, Dasha Nekrasova. Formerly known as Bernie-loving Sailor Socialism, Nekrasova has embraced an extremely traditionalist version of Catholicism, one which rejects basically any and all progressive changes made in recent decades. The Catholic aesthetic is also influencing fashion, where we're seeing an increased emphasis on modesty and accessories like rosaries and crucifixes, though it's unclear whether the trend is sincere, ironic, or a mixture of the two. As author Tara Isabella Burton writes, the idea of the rebellious traditionalist, someone who at once hungers for an idealized past and is somehow considered thoroughly punk rock for doing so, is a perennial one, particularly in reactionary and far-right circles. Burton's comparison of contemporary traditionalism to punk rock seems especially apt when you consider that many of the most famous punk rockers like Johnny Rotten and Johnny Ramone embraced super conservative politics despite singing shit like this. God save the Queen! She ain't no human being! On face, there seems to be a pretty simple explanation for the return to traditional morals, social norms, and aesthetics. It's a symptom of uncertain times. What with rampant financial instability, and ever-present pandemic, climate catastrophe, all the other stuff, you know the rest, it's not good, we don't like talking about it. And retreating into tradition amidst widespread instability is nothing new, notably occurring during the Victorian era. While this period evokes images of dusty mansions and frilly nightgowns, it also coincided with the rapid industrialization and urbanization of the British Empire. And one other thing was also changing. Women were increasingly entering the labor force and public life more generally. Shockingly, these new roles for women bred anxiety. By 1905, a senior physician at Bethlehem Royal Hospital argued that the removal of woman from her natural sphere of domesticity to that of mental labor not only renders her less fit to maintain the virility of the race, but it renders her prone to degenerate. That's right, ladies, reading a book is likely to scramble your eggs. Victorian society had a built-in coping mechanism for dealing with this newfound gender anxiety. Victorian gender ideology centered on the doctrine of separate spheres, which posited a yin-yang vision of gender. It'll sound familiar to any fans of Romania's #1 sex trafficker. Man strong, woman weak. Men like sex. Women like babies. Men like pub. Women like kitchen. While Professor Catherine Hughes notes that in earlier centuries, it had been usual for women to work alongside husbands and brothers in the family business, in the Victorian era, men and women's roles became more sharply defined than at any time in history. Of course, this didn't apply to working class women who still had to #hustle. We saw a similar retreat to tradition in 1950s America during a time of massive change. See, the 50s were more complicated than Leave It to Beaver would have you think. This era saw new gay and lesbian bars, interest in racy things like psychoactive drugs and pinup models, and new research on sexuality, including the Kinsey reports, which discovered that approximately 50% of American adults were low-key super kinky. Gender roles had also come into question since, during World War II, women entered the workforce in droves and proved to be just as capable as men. And again, alongside this change came a reactionary fetishizing of domesticity and pressure towards conformity to rigid gender roles. Once the war ended, women's employment was no longer encouraged, and federal and civilian policies replaced them with returning soldiers. Middle and upper class women were left to entertain themselves with Jell-O molds and Valium. Traditionalism isn't only about morality and gender norms, though. It's also expressed aesthetically through fashion. We saw a nostalgic longing for a simpler time in the indie hipster fashion, which saw a resurgence after the 2008 financial crisis. Culture critic Isabel Sloan writes, "Indie sleaze serves as a somewhat painful reminder of the last gasp in a time when it was possible to envision a future unscathed by the ravages of late capitalism." She adds that it's about nostalgia for a world in which you could still live cheaply on basically nothing. Millennial hipsters fully retreated into analog tech, like fixed gear bikes and record players, and embraced a DIY spirit with a look to match: lumberjack flannel and mustaches. So where does this desire to flirt with moral, gender, and aesthetic traditionalism come from? For one, traditional gender roles are tempting when society faces a new and challenging economic situation. Take the tradwife phenomenon. It's often painted by outlets like The Daily Wire as a culture war between blue-haired feminists and good Christian women who follow biblical expectations like submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord. But some scholars argue that this is simplistic and prefer to see renewed interest in trad culture through the lens of capitalism's outsized expectations on women. Scholars Catherine Rottenberg and Shawnee Orgad write, "The current toxic, always-on work culture must be understood as a key factor facilitating the rise of this retro movement. Combined with entrenched gendered social norms, the burden of care disproportionately falls on women. Even relatively privileged women therefore find it difficult to live up to the popular feminist ideal of work-life balance. Women who opt out of the dual roles of employee and housewife unsurprisingly find themselves relieved. As one self-identified tradwife attests, being a tradwife is empowering and has enabled me to take back control of my life." Of course, scholars point out that the tradwife's rejection of work is ironic because they monetize their social media presence with classes, books, ads, etc. Though when they do, they're treated pretty judgmentally. At the same time, radical social change always generates anxiety about how to live rightly, which can motivate a turn to tradition. As Rottenberg and Orgad note, we live in a time when normative gender roles and dominant notions of sexuality have not only been challenged but are in flux. As such, reasserting a narrowly defined version of femininity may be a way for some women to gain a sense of control over their lives. Retreating into traditional beliefs is also particularly tempting when society faces new threats. A study by UCLA psychologists found that during the pandemic, participants reported conforming more strongly to traditional gender roles and believing more strongly in traditional gender stereotypes than they did before. The scholars note that terror management theory has been used to explain such shifts towards conservative beliefs. The theory suggests that, in the presence of threats, adhering to established belief systems and identities can enable individuals to achieve existential security. In other words, lack of control over external conditions can lead to a desire for internal control and order. So traditional morality and gender norms flourish during times of instability. But traditional aesthetics are similarly tempting when society faces changing moral norms and new social criticism. For example, young people today are witnessing the rise of new civil rights movements, wherein cultural appropriation of marginalized groups and cultures, once pretty flagrant and common, are now considered tasteless and immoral and also just embarrassing. Therefore, toying with Catholic aesthetics becomes a safe yet provocative alternative. As artist Samuel Marion, who studies online culture, puts it, taste-making habits have become magnetized towards forms of appropriation that have no overt racial ties. Hence the blue-collar Dickies fascination, normcore, cowboy LARPing, Walden cosplay, and now trad wives too. But the appeal is not completely ironic. Liberty McKenna, a London-based fashion researcher and archivist, argues that alt-trad aesthetics show millennial and Gen Zers' quest to find meaning, given the precarity experienced by many young adults, which is arguably also tied to the astrology boom of the last several years, and even to the popularity of philosophy and theory meme accounts. Faced with truly contemporary problems, retreating into the past can paradoxically feel like the most subversive option. Vice writer Biz Sherbert concurs that it's easy to see how a girl who got her star sign tattooed on her wrist in 2019 might pivot to trad signaling in 2021. Underneath spiritually saturated aesthetics is often a sideways yearning for a divine order that makes sense of a world that is casually cruel and unpredictable. Whether it's finding order in your Scorpio rising sign or in being a housewife, the underlying drive is basically the same. There's a twin appeal of these aesthetically alt-traditionalist movements, as Burton explains. First, they give a sense that the world has an inherently meaningful and exciting structure. Second, they present the chance to participate in a movement that blends the security of belonging to a cohesive group with the thrill of cultural transgression. In general, when society is under pressure, it becomes easier to look backwards than to forge new norms. As historian Mark Lilla puts it, one need not have read Kierkegaard to know the anxiety that accompanies historical consciousness, that inner cramp that comes when time lurches forward and we feel ourselves catapulted into the future. Take the example of recent criticism of sex scenes in movies and television, like the discourse over Penn Badgley's discomfort with them, or whether an explicit scene in the show Swarm was necessary. When faced with the complexities of sex, work, and media, as well as Hollywood's history of mistreating actors in sex scenes, the simplest answer could reasonably seem to be, maybe it's just too complicated. Let's go back in time. But the reactive desire to limit sex scenes could have unintended consequences, like the censoring of queer representation, or even the return of something like an audience-enforced version of the old-school Hays Code. The code banned perversion in movies, resulting in the exclusion of queer people and healthy depictions of sex from cinema entirely. Now, of course, concerns about sexual misconduct on film sets are valid. Since the revelations of Me Too, sexual misconduct in the industry is finally being taken seriously. But sex scenes can, of course, be handled respectfully, as the recent rise of intimacy coordinators shows. These are professionals trained to ensure the comfort and safety of actors when they participate in sex scenes. They're so effective that the Screen Actors Guild has called for them to be mandatory. But despite productive change, resisting the reactionary impulse can be hard. That's because, according to Lilla, reactionary ideology is a bit different from conservative ideology. Reactionaries are revolutionaries that seek to restore a mythicized past. They see progress as akin to betrayal. As Lilla puts it, every major social transformation leaves behind a fresh Eden that can serve as the object of somebody's nostalgia. And nostalgic reactionism can be far more seductive than optimism for the future. As Lilla adds, hopes can be disappointed. Nostalgia is irrefutable. Philosopher Alain Badiou, for his part, defines reactionaries as those who refuse to recognize a new truth, whether it be artistic, political, or scientific. For Badiou, rather than being contemporary with the logic of a situation, the reactionary wants to deny and suppress the new thing that's happening. Think a monarchist during the French Revolution arguing that the peasant revolt was just a phase, or folks in the early 90s saying that hip-hop was just a fad and not real music. Rekindling the spirit of the past may seem appealing in uncertain times. It may even be fun or comforting to play with old-fashioned styles and norms, but it can also make us miss the bigger picture and ignore the real cause of our malaise. For example, tradwives look to the past for solutions, but as we noted, they're struggling with contemporary problems, specifically the outsized expectations put on women to balance their work and home lives with ease. Solutions to that problem for many women likely don't lie in 1950s gender norms, but rather in meaningful economic and social reforms, like, for the love of God, universal childcare. But that raises a different problem. According to scholar Albert O. Hirschman's analysis in The Rhetoric of Reaction, reactionaries often subscribe to the futility thesis, dismissing any attempts at reforming flawed systems as inept. Reactionaries scoff at progressives who they see as pretending to change the unchangeable. Retreating into a nostalgia-soaked past thus becomes both an appealing coping mechanism and a way of not dealing with all the hard work of instigating systematic changes that could actually improve the future. But what do you all think? Is society drunk on nostalgia? Is looking backwards the best way to find inspiration on how to live today, or should we work harder to create our own new values? Let us know in the comments. A huge shout out to all of our patrons who participate in the non-traditional system of supporting us directly and getting early videos with no ads and extra content in return. If you're interested, which you should be, check out the link in the description. But thanks to all of you for being here, for watching the videos, for supporting the channel, for feeding the algorithm. It helps us, and you know it does, and we know that you know it does. So thanks so much. In the meantime, let's keep our eyes set to the future, and we'll see you later.